All right, everyone, I want to go ahead and get things started. Welcome to this week's meeting, OPI API work group. Um, so a couple weeks ago, I was out last time, as I said, I was on business travel. But last meeting, we were talking about some of the basic functionality, how we try to break down the different pieces, look at it from, do we define the system as a device, um, et cetera. And I put out some high-level diagrams that I'll share again here. Um, here we go. So I tried to start looking at things from, if you look at it from a card perspective or a platform perspective or whatever, what some of the parameters are that we could go about using for configuration. I think in that discussion, we kind of felt that really the way to look at this is to treat it, a DPU, an IPU, or whatever, as a line card, but not necessarily utilize kind of these definitions under line card, because this really looks at it from a platform perspective. So there was some thoughts around that um, in the last meeting, um, but to to really just start to focus in on the the network itself, and line cards have interfaces. So if we look more really at the interface type definition, this is kind of what I tried to start mapping out when you start looking at an interface itself. um, so this would give us some of the basics to try to define what a port would look like. Um, and we're going to have both logical ports as well as physical ports. So if we consider that aspect of it, then you've got these varying pieces that we can start to think about configuring. From an interface perspective, at a very high level, we're talking about, MTUs and loopback, and just whether or not you enable or disable the interface. Excuse me. If we really go down and look at it from an Ethernet perspective, we can actually go out and we can do configurations on MAC addresses, auto negotiation, the types of modes that you want to run in, like duplex mode, port speed, etc. These are kind of the things that I would think we would want to try to put together from a port perspective as a basic interface, and then treat it as one, things that you can do to a physical interface, and two, things that you can do to a logical interface. The question is, how often do we need to manipulate a physical port interface versus logical? Because typically from the DPU IPU perspective, it's going to expose logical interfaces more than likely up to the local ARM cores, for example, or perhaps all the way up to the host. Um, does anybody have thoughts around that, or if there's other parameters and things that need to be considered around this configuration view? The reason I'm putting this out there is, we've been talking about how do we get back to defining the basic functionality that we need to build up in an API. It's really about saying, hey, I got to start with the ports, the physical interfaces, etc., and then build my way up to logical or virtual ports, and then again on top of that, look at it from, what do I need to do for layer 2, what do I need to lay on for VLAN, et cetera, and then potentially what do I need to do for some basic routing functionality. And of course, this is also being talked about in the TSC. So any thoughts around this?
So just thinking about your question about physical versus logical, I'm not sure it matters too much. I mean,
Right.
there's going to be physical ports need configured anyway. The outward-facing physical port for interconnectivity will need configured, and this looks like a reasonable um, list of properties. I would probably cross-reference against what Linux expects for or offers in terms of port properties and work out if there's anything obvious missing.
Yeah, that
Uh,
was my next step, is to actually go look at the Linux properties and try to see
yeah.
is there anything missing from what I put together here. Okay. No, thanks, Donald. That's good. Um, I've started to build this into a protobuf model also, so I will probably put a PR out for people to review, just so that we can start iterating and moving it forward. And of course, I'm trying to look at it from the perspective of you have a logical. So this is where I put the logical definition in here, where it looks at state, is it'll determine whether it's a physical port or a logical port based upon this particular key parameter. Okay. But I did want to put this out there. This is where I have gotten to. I can probably put this out as a, have to figure out how to export this. It's a Visio diagram right now, but I'll figure out if there's a way that I can export this into something that people can review and give feedback on. Okay.
Yeah,
This
I'm just
go
having a
ahead.
very quick look at what Linux supports on, because of course they mix the concept of a port and a link. So there's a whole bunch of link atters, but many of them will probably be irrelevant to us. But then many of them probably are, because it's things like talking about number of queues, TX queues, RX queues, things like that. So
Yep.
I suspect we'll have a bit of a challenge honing down what we think is appropriate and relevant. But I'll share a link because it's available on docs.kernel.org. I'll just paste it into the Slack.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah. Yeah. Anything that can help point to it. I was out looking at the Netlink and things like that to try to determine what Netlink may provide, since that's typically the way
Yeah.
we use it
So
for Linux.
this is the doc rendering of one of the Netlink specs for RT-Link that I'm sharing.
Okay, awesome. Okay. Now, and this way I can put out, at least try to put together and put out a PR with a proposed start for a protobuf model for that low level, so that we can start building our way up from the port perspective. I did start to map out, where a VLAN would sit into the model, because an interface can specify that it is a VLAN type interface, or a sub interface similarly can do some definitions, and then of course they treat a VLAN kind of as a sub interface type. But you can also have a switched VLAN, which they don't treat that way. And some of this I'm pulling out of, I've looked at OpenConfig models and tried to see how they map everything. So there's still more mapping to do. So this is where I've gotten to over the last little over a week. Any feedback or any other topics that folks need to cover or want to bring up today?
Hey, Mark, I have a question on this model. Is this
Sure.
trying to address the use case of DPU more or less acting as a part of a switch or a switch?
So what we're trying to do is take a step back. A lot of the things that we've done in the past have been around, well, let's look at this use case, let's look at that use case,
Mhm.
let's build models and things around those. And what we tried to do is say, well, part of the issue is that we haven't even really defined the basics by going down and saying, okay, I've got physical ports on a device, and
Mhm.
then those physical ports can fan out into logical or virtual ports. And then how do I configure each one of those entities just from that level?
Mm.
And then I can start laying additional things on top of that, like looking at it from a basic bridge, basic switch is probably a better way of doing it, you know, basic L2 switch.
Got it.
And what additional properties and things do I need for a basic L2 switch? You know, how do I apply a VLAN to that, because that's kind of still sitting at the L2 layer. And then we were going to build again on top of that with an L3. Donald was this morning in the TSC was presenting the deck that they put together on, from Red Hat's perspective, on what they feel like the basic things are, and then trying to go from that and define what we should do for milestone points. And the first step was, you know, having a basic set of milestones that said, hey, you know, I can go in from the rudimentary level and I'll provision everything, and then I will configure the ports for the different initial capabilities. I'll set up the port with the different queues and things like that that I want to use. And then on top of that, I might build a switch, basic switch, right? And so those were the things that they wanted to bring out as saying, let's do this as milestone one, because right now we've got a bunch of use case API definitions that vendors and various people can't agree on, because everybody wants it done this way or that way or another way. And of course, we got into another big discussion around vendor specifics and how they want to look at it from application layer, et cetera.
Okay.
Does that help set the context, Vipin?
Yeah, it does, because I was thinking, since we were targeting use cases, and I missed one of the meetings probably where the context was sent, but
Yeah.
But this is more of a generic approach to the problem than a specific use case. That makes
Yep.
sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We're trying to take it back and say, hey, let's go back and look at it from a generic build-up perspective. You know, and we've got all of the use case ones that we can eventually feed back in. But the hope is that if we build this thing and look at it from, you know, here's the basics, let's build our way up, then everything will start to fit better, and then we can tie everything together with use cases.
Makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll try to figure out a good way of publishing this, even if I have to just put it into a PNG file and post it out there so people can take a look at it. I will at least get it into the meeting minutes and post that on the wiki page. And that's really all I had for this week. We're still in a lot of discussions around, you know, getting the milestone view set. So we'll probably start having some feedback on what the milestone we think is and what level of definition that we want to go into. But I will start by, let me share one other thing that I'm working on, just so people can see the thoughts around this. As soon as I find the right screen. Well, thought I had it pulled up, yeah. Do. If I can get it to share. Here we go. I found it. Sorry about that. So this is where I've started to, and of course I'm looking at it from starting with an open config model, but I know it needs to expand out and probably some of the parameters need to change from this. But this is kind of the definitions that I'm working on for looking at an Ethernet config. So you've got, all those parameters that I was showing that I've initially put in here. You've got all of the incoming and interface counters, etc., that we'll have to keep track of, and then of course state settings, which tells you where things are set to, and then of course the interface definition for an Ethernet type interface, and then of course I've got the interfaces protobuf as well as network types, and which is the high level view, and then the VLAN. I started mapping out a VLAN so that you can attach VLANs to it. So what I'll probably do is start by posting out the interfaces, Ethernet and VLAN grouping, and try to get some feedback from the API team in terms of, does this make sense? What are we missing? And then how we can add to it. So I'll work on seeing what I can do about getting a PR put together for that.
Hey, Mark, I'm
Yeah.
wondering if we can put together like some document that actually explains the target that we have with this API and what each of those protobuf files they meant to configure, like a document that explains those things. Because if we want to
Sure.
explain that to somebody, it will be hard. So
Yeah.
if you can just like a small document that explains what we're trying to do and what those protobufs files they meant to configure, something like this, it will be really
Sure.
beneficial.
Sure.
Yeah.
Nope, that's a good idea. I'll add that into the notes. Make sure
Okay.
we get that in there also.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Demetrius. That's good. That's a good point. All right. So that's what I had to put out there today. I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to bring up. If not, we'll make it a relatively short meeting this week. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining, and we'll catch up again probably next week.
Thanks. See you all next
Thanks.
week.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, everyone.